So in Spengler, we are now up to Chapter 3 in Volume 2. It's called Origin and Landscape, Part C, the relations between cultures. Before, he had talked about the group of the higher cultures and how they constitute a unity that is distinct from the world of primitive man. Now he's going to talk about the whole concept of the idea of one culture influencing another culture, and how it is, what he starts off by saying here is that it's not so much influence. He says it's not products that influence a culture, but rather creators within that culture who absorb and creatively transform that form language, that alien form language. Whether they keep the same words or not doesn't matter. The meanings will be changed, deliberately changed, so that, for example, what the Renaissance takes over from the Greeks, or what the Gothic world takes over from the Magian Christian world, is really only the outer trappings, the outer visible form language, the words, but the meanings are changed, deliberately forgotten. They may never have been known exactly what the original meanings were in the first place, as in many of these form borrowings. They're forgotten, repressed, or otherwise misunderstood deliberately in a deliberate way. For example, Spengler says that what we Faustians understand by the meaning of grace is different from the way Augustine understood it. For Augustine, grace was a spiritual substance, a spiritual entity, the pneuma, that came down into the soul as a substance and transubstantiated it in a very alchemical way. For us, the idea, as Calvin articulates it, is that grace affects the will, changes the will and the types of decisions then that the individual then proceeds to make. It's a very different idea. And then he says that we're very selective, civilizations are very selective about what they take. Even though we had, he says, the entirety of the Greek form world there in front of us, what was taken from them was very selective. For example, it's interesting to note what was left out. What we didn't take was the form of the Doric temple, for example, which had almost no influence on our architectural styles. We didn't take the Doric column, we preferred the Corinthian. We didn't take the custom of representing in base painting a figure minus the ground. We didn't take that rather unperspectable art style. We didn't take their particular relation of column and architrave. There are all these things that we did not take, that we deliberately excluded because either we didn't understand them or they were alien to our sense of what things ought to mean, metaphysically and cosmically speaking. Aristotle says the soul is the form of the body. For us, that's a very odd, strange, nonsensical statement. And so it doesn't make any sense, any more than Aristotle's elaborate conception of the cosmos as all these spheres within spheres within spheres, to the point that he's got something like 52 of them. That seems absurd and unnecessary for us. But it was perfectly consistent with the Greek worldview, the Greek feeling, the Greek understanding of being. So what one culture takes from another can be very superficial in terms of, let's say, for example, let's take the Grail quests, the Arthurian literature. The Arthurian Grail quest is a literature that's based on a native Celtic myth, the idea of the quest for the inexhaustible cauldron. In Celtic myth, it wasn't the cup that Christ drank from at the Last Supper. It's some sort of a cauldron, Manannán MacLear's cauldron that he has underneath the ocean, that anyone who drinks from will be magically regenerated, or it might be a special type of plate or a cornucopia horn of inexhaustible abundance that just pours forth, and which we can see the prototype for actually in Europe, going all the way back to 20,000 BC to the relief carving in France of the Venus of Lazelle, who holds in one hand the horn, the buffalo horn, that has 13 incisions on it and connects it with the moon. The moon pours forth its substance inexhaustibly. Same idea. It's a native Celtic culture form that is expressed through the alien form language of the Christian world. But the idea of the Grail quest is itself something alien. The idea of the Grail quest is that each individual, as Joseph Campbell used to point out, each individual goes out questing for that Grail by himself. They don't go as a group. When we think of the fishermen, apostles, and the community of Christ, on the other hand, they're all together as a group, and they're all in quest of the same basic idea of how to become receptive to the pneuma, the spirit, the substance that descends down, transforms the soul, and becomes the glue by way of which a community is held together. In the West, the community doesn't matter as much. It's the individual menschwerdung, the individuation process, the realization of a life through the process of actualizing the potential, that which you are in essence, what Schopenhauer calls the earned character that you gradually find out about yourself over time, as opposed to the intelligible character, which is the sort of a priori numinous monad, the realm, the Jungian self, basically. These are all ideas that are unique to the Faustian civilization and which are completely alien to the consensus mentality of the Magian. And so even though all this Christian form language has been taken over with the Knights of the Round Table, just as one random example, it's really a completely different mythos. So we've had, this also links to the idea of the pseudomorphosis, and we've had in the West a very strong Levantine Magian pseudomorphosis, the imposition by force of an alien religion that has no relationship to the form language of the land, as Joseph Campbell used to talk about endlessly over and over ad nauseum in his lectures, that it's not rooted in the land. It's a language that has come from the desert, from a desert world that's alien to Europe with different form language altogether. But it was used nevertheless, as Spengler says here, as something purely shallow, surface level, and is something that gradually was shed. Same thing with our classical inheritance. It is something that gradually had to be shed and metabolized out of the culture. So that's the point that he makes in the introduction to this. And it seems to me that Heidegger's whole task, his performance of deconstruction, what he calls destruction, the Abbau, the performance of the destruction whereby he's trying to get back to the early, original, authentic understandings of Greek philosophical ideas, is precisely the same thing that Spengler's talking about. Heidegger is deliberately trying to destroy and wipe out the last vestiges of the classical pseudomorphosis within the realm of philosophy. He's trying to flush it out once and for all by paradoxically going back to the original understandings of the Greek ideas, like the Greek idea of physis, which we simply translate as nature, and we understand nature as a field that is there for our will to act aggressively upon and overmaster by force. The Greeks understood nothing of the kind. As Heidegger points out, physis puts all the autonomy on entities, on the external world, who arise up out of the darkness, shine forth, manifest their numinous wonder, their mystery, and then disappear again. And it's a mystery to the intellect of the pre-Socratic philosopher that is confronted with the wonder of this mystery. I would also say, though, that even that is very Germanic. Heidegger's language, the whole idea of the Lichtung, the clearing, things unconcealing themselves out of the darkness and going back again, it's all forest language. All of Heidegger's language has been drawn from a man living in the Black Forest, from a culture that came out of the great northern Gothic forests. It's already a language that already, even though he's saying that he's going back to the Greek concepts, is nonetheless still filtering them through native forms. This is a little bit like the idea that you find, when you look at Renaissance art and you get the motif painted over and over again of the adoration of the Magi, or some scene from the classical world, and they're all wearing Renaissance costumes. They're dressed as though these events were taking place in Renaissance Italy, which they're not. Of course, they come from another world, but they're dressed up in a contemporary form language. So the way in which civilizations basically influence each other, Spengler is saying here, is not the way it's normally portrayed in scholarship. It's not fundamental. It's not something that changes the essence of the culture. It may be a struggle for the culture to express itself through the form language, and the Arabian, Islamic, Judeo-Christian, Islamic culture expressing itself through the late classical culture forms was perhaps the toughest pseudomorphosis, the heaviest, and the hardest for them to find their own unique expression language. But nonetheless, the influences still are very superficial, according to Spengler. These cultures are like windowless, like Leibniz's windowless monads, which are not very open. Their essence, their basic entelechies, what they want to do and what they want to see and how they see the world, cannot be changed. It's merely the outer trappings of them that are changed. And so in this chapter, what Spengler's going to do as a case study of this is to talk about law. It sounds dry and boring, but it's actually a lot more interesting. It's like the chapter, the second chapter in Volume 1 on mathematics. It's similar to that. You think it's going to be one thing, but it turns out to be another matter altogether. And he says that the way law has been understood in these three civilizations, the classical, the Magian, and the Faustian, is very different. He says, if we go back to the classical understanding of law and look at it, he says, law in the classical world is law made by citizens for citizens who are living in a particular city-state. It presupposes the idea of membership in a polis, and the law is addressed to the individual person, the individual as a person who is a body among bodies. And there are distinctions made. The slave does not have a person. A slave is merely a body. There is no person there. Person in the sense of persona. The word persona basically is what the law addresses. The whole sense of the public self, which we regard, which Jung regards as merely the superficial, is for the Greeks of the essence. This idea of an interior monologue, a private Faustian self, is alien to the classical understanding of the self. Consequently, in classical drama, we have the idea that the chorus is this sort of ideal public that comments on everything that the tragic protagonist is suffering, and the whole essence of it is this public experience. In Shakespeare's tragedies, the key thing that corresponds to the chorus, which is a public examination of the fate of these individuals, is the monologue. The Shakespearean monologue where the individual is alone talking to himself. That's the essence of the Faustian personality. So we make a distinction between persona and self that is not made, according to Spengler, by the classical man. Classical man is persona. He is a public self, and everything that he does and happens to him is public. So the law in the classical world is addressed to the persona. This is distinct from the thing, the res, as it is also distinct from the slave, who is merely a body, not a person. In the case of certain heroes in the myths, Spengler says the godhead can displace the sense of the person, the persona, and a cult can therefore be generated around the hero. But it's really the persona that is being addressed by the law. And he says that, furthermore, that the sense of law for the classical world is really an empirical science of individual cases. They never did have the sense of law as a universally binding, one single law, valid for all time, the way we Faustians conceived of. They have this idea, each separate city-state has its own collection of laws. Law is local to each city and governs what the Romans called the quirites, the citizens of the Roman city, and they are protected by the jus civilis, which is the law that the magistrate, the praetor, who is the highest magistrate in the land, and he's second only in his political power to the consul, who corresponds to our idea of the president, although there were two of them, two consuls. And the praetor is elected every year on an annual basis, but Spengler says that, note that when he comes into office, he can create a whole new body of laws to be valid for that year that weren't there the year before. He can choose to carry over, and in many cases does carry over the precedents of the laws that have come over in the reign of the praetor before him, but he doesn't necessarily have to do that, and he creates new laws. Laws are largely, they're not stored up in a comprehensive way and meant to be valid for all time. The laws governing the outer world of the individual beyond the Roman city-state, which eventually, of course, becomes the Roman Imperium, is the jus gentium, and that covers all the foreigners, everyone who is outside the realm of the Roman universal city, the ecumeny, the Roman ecumeny, and is governed by a special type of praetor called the peregrine praetor. And the peregrine praetor, he says, over time began to come slowly into the foreground and become more and more important in proportion to the expansion of the Imperium. Because Rome is a single city and the Roman Empire basically is an expansion of a single city into a world city, the law becomes binding for its citizens, but who became, according to Spengler, an ever-shrinking class, while the jus gentium became larger and larger as we get all these foreign individuals and aliens coming in from all over the place. And so Roman law protects then only the quirites, the citizens. Faustian law, however, is one universally binding, overarching law. And then he has this idea that if we contrast this, classical law is of course the law of an ahistoric society. It doesn't have any sense of setting up a precedent for the future in which the law will be binding for all time. In contrast, he says, to, let's say, English law, where the judge is an individual who declares the law in the sense that he clarifies the law. He can take a pre-existing law and find that it's deficient in this particular case, and then it needs to be clarified. That is, certain aspects of it that are implicit need to be made explicit. But when he does so, the alterations that he makes to the law then have to be incorporated for all time as a permanently valid precedent. The classical man didn't work that way. He went case by case, moment by moment. His law was not universally valid for all time. It is a law of bodies, a Euclidean law of statics. It's perfectly consistent with Euclidean mathematics. And Spengler says there is a way in which mathematics is consistent with the particular type of law that a civilization comes up with. The two are consistent with each other, and so in the classical world we get this world of mathematics.